Hello, everyone. My name is David Buckley, and I'm the Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion here at the University of Louisville. I am also interim director of the Center for Asian Democracy, which is hosting this conversation today. CAD is glad to be sponsoring the 2022 meeting of the Southeast Conference of the Asian Studies Association, which is going on this January here in Louisville. We're going to be speaking this week to some of the conference's presenters, hearing a little bit about how their academic research ties to timely questions related to democracy across the region. And to start that off, there is no one better to join us than Professor Susan Brownell. She is professor of anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis. At UMSL, she is an internationally recognized expert on Chinese sports and Olympic Games. She was a nationally ranked track and field athlete in the United States, and her work, Training the Body for China, Sports and the Moral Order of the People's Republic, is the first book on Chinese sports based on fieldwork in China by a Westerner. She's also the author of Beijing's Games, What the Olympics Mean to China from 2008, which is, of course, a book title that could also be very interestingly applied to right now, and one reason that we're so glad to have this conversation today. So first off, thanks for joining us. We're very glad to have the chance to have this conversation. And thanks to our colleagues in Asian Studies here at U of L, and for all those who are working on organizing the Southeast Conference in this coming week. Maybe we can start off by giving our audience a little bit of background. So some may have heard that the Winter Olympics are coming in Beijing well, not quite this week, but in the next couple of weeks. The Biden administration, some may have heard, has announced an American diplomatic boycott of these games. We hear boycott, and that's a term with some history with the Olympics, but diplomatic boycott sounds a little different. So maybe as somebody who tracks these things, can you tell us a little bit what this actually means in practice?
Yeah, so the Biden administration has defined it as saying that they will not send any official representatives who are government officials. So no official representatives of the United States. This is something that, as far as I've been able to figure out, hasn't been done before. So that specific phrase, diplomatic boycott, I don't believe has been applied to, these kinds of political efforts in the context of the Olympic Games. In 2008, there were a number of heads of state who said they would not attend the Olympic opening ceremony. And so that was a political statement that was made in 2008. And as far as I've been able to figure out, it wasn't called a diplomatic boycott because in some cases, the head of state attended the closing ceremony, not the opening ceremony. So it wasn't an across the board withdrawal of official government representatives. But where to draw the line on who is an official government representative is kind of interesting because, then it turned out shortly after declaring the diplomatic boycott, the Biden administration applied for visas for 30 government, employees from the State Department who were described as just support staff that they normally send to Olympic Games to help with any issues that may arise with the Olympic team. Well, of course, the Chinese are spinning that and saying, well, we find it quite ironic that you said you weren't sending any government officials, and then you immediately applied for visas for 30 government officials. So, it is a new practice, and maybe figuring out who's in and who's out in terms of being a quote unquote diplomat, maybe an evolving situation.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that there's obviously a long history of boycotts involving the Olympics, not just involving China, but probably most famously, for those who may remember, involving the United States and the USSR during the Cold War. One thing that you've been talking about is what's different sort of in terms of the origins and the groups pushing for this boycott and what this boycott looks like in terms of lobbying from groups outside of government as well as sort of great power inside government. Where is this coming from? Who are the groups who are pushing for this, and how is that different from sort of the older history of Cold War boycotts mutually between the US and the USSR?
Right. One point that I've been trying to emphasize very strongly to anybody who will listen was that the whole idea of a boycott and the direction from which the calls for boycotts are coming is very different now compared to the Cold War era. well, I would say Olympic history from the beginning, you know, in the early 20th century, all the way up until the end of the Cold War, the main calls for boycotts were coming from national governments that had conflicts with other national governments. And of course, that is what happened in 1980 when Jimmy Carter pulled the US out of the Moscow Olympics in protest of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. And then in 1984, the Soviet Union retaliated by not sending any athletes or, you know, any delegates of any kind to the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games. So that tit for tat is really the most famous boycott effort in Olympic history, and typically the one we think of when we hear the word boycott. But, you know, I just think it's significant to note that that series of boycotts really discredited that type of boycott because, of course, some 2 decades later, the US ended up invading Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union never left, didn't leave for another 10 years. So the US boycott was completely ineffective. Jimmy Carter today is remembered as one of our weakest presidents, and maybe that effort is part of that memory. And then the US turned around and did exactly what it had boycotted the Soviet Union for. And so it just kind of made the US look hypocritical, and it really, I think, discredited the idea that boycotts of that nature can accomplish political goals. So at the end of the Cold War, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, got a new president, Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was an experienced diplomat. And he initiated an effort in which he went around the world requesting meetings with heads of state and trying to get them on board with a consensus that those kinds of national boycotts don't accomplish political goals and they only harm the athletes. So the fact that they harm the athletes was something that was really emphasized. And it's true. I mean, I was an athlete. I competed in the 1980 Olympic trials in track and field. I didn't make the team, but I remember very well the fact we knew before the Olympic trials that we wouldn't be going. So, you know, there was all this discussion among the athletes about what it meant. I think it resulted in cynicism towards our government by the athletes who suddenly realized, hey, we're just pawns. Our dream that we've been training for so long can be taken away from us at a moment's notice. And particularly in those days, it really seemed unfair because the US government gives no money directly to athletes or, for that matter, to the US Olympic Committee, which is supported by revenue from the Olympic trademarks and the broadcasting fees. So, you know, the fact that we'd been struggling supporting ourselves with college scholarships or working as menial workers, men were typically postal workers, women were typically waitresses, and that the US government, you know, could turn around and take that away from us just really seemed unfair. So, you know, many of the athletes of that generation are now the leaders of world sport and the leaders in the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So that too has contributed to this general feeling in the sports world that that kind of national boycott doesn't achieve political goals and harms the athletes. And that is the consensus that you now hear expressed by everybody, including the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee in the letter it submitted to Congress when Congress had a hearing about the issue. So I think that consensus looks as strong now as it ever has. And by the way, we haven't had any of these national boycotts since the end of the Cold War. So this has been a long-term consensus, which I think is even stronger than ever before. So I think the thought that there might be a systematic boycott by nations who will not send any athletes at all is just, it's just not going to happen. So where are the boycott calls coming from? And, you know, why have we got a different version of the boycott now? And what has happened is that since the end of the Cold War, non-governmental organizations or NGOs have been increasing rapidly across the landscape. I mean, in 1990, the organization that sort of registers international NGOs said that there were 6,000 of them in the world. And that organization, by 2008, when China hosted its first Olympic Games, had 40,000 active registered international non-governmental organizations. And that number is constant now, about 40,000 active ones and another 30,000 inactive ones. So something that has changed in the global balance of power since the end of the Cold War is the rise of NGOs as what some scholars have called the third force in global politics after corporations and governments. And if you look carefully, they are the ones who have been initiating calls for boycotts and different kinds of protests. In this cycle, it has largely come from NGOs whose cause is the repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and also the crackdown in Hong Kong. Although there are certainly a multitude of other issues that are taken up by NGOs according to what their mission is.
That's great. Yeah. And, as you sort of pivot to talking about China and a couple of the concrete issues that have attracted NGO attention this time around, I'm curious if you could give a little bit of your perspective on why sport in general, and the Olympics in particular, has become such an important part of Chinese government's attempt to build its sort of soft power or build its reputation on the international stage. You've obviously been researching this for a long time. So some general perspective might be helpful on why sport is so useful or attractive to the Chinese government. But maybe even more particularly, has anything changed? So you wrote a book in 2008 on what the Olympics mean to China. I don't know if you're thinking of it, but if you were going to put out another edition of that book, would the answer change right now or not? Is essentially the same dynamic at play?
Well, people in the West are sometimes surprised to learn that the region of East Asia actually has a very long history of sort of sports and the use of sports as a diplomatic tool and the politicization of sports that goes all the way back to the world's first regional games, the Far Eastern Championship Games, which took place in East Asia in the early 20th century. So there is actually a long history of sports being used as a diplomatic tool, which is interesting because that's in the absence of a grassroots sports culture like we have in the West. So that particularly, heading into the 21st century had become a rivalry between South Korea, Japan, and China. I mean, the rivalry in East Asia over sports. So, then we had the fact that after the Communist Party came to power in China in 1949, China had been excluded from all the conventional diplomatic channels with the leadership of the United States. So it was not a member of the United Nations. It withdrew from the International Olympic Committee over the committee's recognition of Taiwan, and it withdrew from almost all major sport federations for the same reason. Official policy did not allow China to be a member of any organization in which Taiwan was a member. So, that did include sports, but sports offered a kind of alternative diplomatic channel to the conventional channels that were just closed. I mean, you're not a member of the United Nations and you don't have diplomatic recognition from most of the world. That is just a closed door. But sports were like a crack in the door where you could sneak in. And I once asked He Zhenliang, so Mr. He Zhenliang was China's first member in the International Olympic Committee, co-opted in 1981, but he had been engaged in the diplomatic efforts with China all those years. And I said, why sports? Like, why did China focus on sports, eventually leading to ping pong diplomacy in the 1970s? And he said, basically, all the other doors are closed to you. What are you going to do? There were like three areas in which you could maybe take part in some international meetings because the socialist countries had a stronger presence there. And those were youth, women, and sports. Because none of those were all that important to the conventional Western powers, so they didn't work so hard to close all the doors there. Anyway, so, that was part of how China sneaked in to the World Table Tennis Championships, and eventually leading to ping pong diplomacy between China and the US. And with the success of those exchanges, China held 2 more major table tennis tournaments in Beijing for the Asian, African, and Latin American countries. And through that, established diplomatic relations with countries who previously had not done so. So there's that history in the 70s, and really that pretty much sealed it. Ever since, ping pong diplomacy, sports have been a major part of China's diplomatic effort. And then in the 21st century, that became rephrased as the pursuit of soft power. And that was a new concept, of course, coming from the American scholar Joseph Nye, but it really took off in East Asia because Japan and Korea had already seen investment in their culture industries as a way of achieving world, attention and improving their national image and that sort of thing. And the reason Japan and South Korea focused on culture is that they don't entirely control their fates with respect to hard power. Japan and Korea both, have the presence of huge numbers of American troops, and their sort of military actions are highly constrained by the US presence. So again, this is, culture was an alternative channel for expressing national power for them, I think. So then China just sort of got in on that act. And I think that's really the main reason China is hosting a Winter Games right now. I think that really was more a product of the rivalry for soft power with Japan and South Korea. South Korea had hosted its first Winter Games in 2018. So at that point, it had done 1 summer and 1 winter, and China just wanted to keep up with South Korea. It had the summer, it wanted a winter too. Of course, they both have a little way to go before they catch up with Japan, which, not to be outdone, hosted its 2nd Summer Games, and it's also hosted 2 Winter Games. So I really think that while the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games were seen by the world and Chinese leadership as China's coming out party as a superpower, I do think that probably the initial motivation for the leadership to bid for the Winter Games was more this regional rivalry.
That's great. That's great. Maybe just to wrap up our conversation then, we've been talking a lot about rivalry, both regionally and sort of geostrategically on an international stage. Sports is also obviously about competition, right, at a certain level, but it is also about cooperation, right? And there is this history of ping pong diplomacy, which you referenced to, which is about not only sort of zero-sum rivalry, but also building cooperation and transnational connections. I'm curious if you see any prospects for that going forward. I mean, the US-China relationship is obviously one that's more tense now than it was 10 years ago. Regional dynamics, both in East Asia and also Southeast Asia, you could probably say the same thing about. And that's come out with this sort of diplomatic boycott around these Olympics. Do you see prospects or examples, even sort of grassroots examples of that more cooperative dimension of sports diplomacy showing through around these games?
Well, I am a little irritated by the rhetoric versus the reality. The reality is, we have Biden sort of stating that China's rise is a threat to US interests, but at the same time, China's trade relations with the US probably make it one of the biggest supporter of US national interests. So, the reality is that, and by the way, this is something that's very different from the Cold War era. We live in just a really tightly interconnected world, and the US is very tightly interconnected with China, and the rest of the world is too. And sports is a very interesting lens actually for looking at that growing interconnection. When I was an athlete during the Cold War, we would go, when we competed against the Soviet Union, we couldn't even talk to them in the dormitories. They had chaperones that, watched them like hawks. A few of them managed to learn a little bit of English on the side, but they weren't allowed to speak it with us. I mean, the Cold War era was a really divided era in which the people on both sides of the divide were just not allowed to get together and talk to each other. Now it's the 21st century. And if we, look only at Chinese sports, international sports is just really transnational. There are Chinese athletes representing countries all over the place, particularly in table tennis. There are Chinese coaches out there in the world. There are American and other international coaches in China working with their athletes. China, of course, is putting an extra effort into trying to get the most gold medals that it can in this upcoming Winter Games. Winter sports are not all that strong in China, except for figure skating and a few other sports, aerials, but and short track speed skating. So China, what does China do? It brings in loads of hockey coaches and luge coaches, and from different parts of the world to help train its athletes. So the reality in sports, as in economics and any other culture, any other realm you can think of, is that we're completely interconnected, and these national divisions really don't mean much anymore. So I'm a little annoyed even by the Biden administration's use of the word boycott, which I think it makes you feel that it's like the Cold War era was, and it's not. We're not in the Cold War era. Olympic Games are different. The boycott whole phenomenon is different. Everything is different. And I'm just not sure that point is coming across, in the media coverage. And I just don't know if the general public really understands that.
Great. Well, that is just super helpful perspective for the general public that you've shared with us today. When we all tune in and hear the Olympic anthem coming on and know that it's Olympic time in a couple of weeks, we'll enjoy the competition, but also understand a little bit more about the subtext of what's going on the political side of things. So thanks so much for joining us today. And to everyone out there, we'll have a series of these conversations in the coming weeks, and we look forward to continuing the conversation moving forward. Thanks again.